The smell of wet concrete, diesel engine exhaust, and roasted plantains had always been the sensory backdrop of Tobiloba's childhood. His father, Babajid Alao, was a giant of a man, not just in physical stature, but in his reputation across Lagos and beyond. Babajid had built Alao and Sons infrastructure from a single second-hand cement mixer into a sprawling construction empire that shaped the skyline of the state. He was a man who believed that concrete was more than just a building material. It was a promise made to the earth. Tobi, at 9 years old, adored him. He spent his weekends trailing his father through dusty construction sites, wearing a miniature yellow hard hat that constantly slipped over his eyes. His mother, Funmaleo, a graceful woman whose laughter could disarm the most stubborn site union leaders, was the anchor of their home in the leafy suburbs of Ikoyi. Then, on a rainy Tuesday evening, the sky fell. Babajid and Funmaleo were returning from a high-stakes business meeting in Ibadan. A heavy downpour had turned the Lagos-Ibadan expressway into a slick, treacherous trap. A container truck, its brakes failing on the descent near Shagamu, lost control and rammed head-on into their SUV. Both of Tobi's parents died before the ambulance could arrive. The news shattered Tobi's world into jagged, unrecognizable pieces. He went from a life of warmth, private tutors, and Sunday afternoon drives to sitting on a hard wooden bench in the family's ancestral home in Abeokuta, surrounded by weeping relatives he barely knew. Among them was his father's younger brother, Aladeo Alao, known to everyone as Uncle Deo. Deo had always lived in Babajid's shadow, relying on handouts and minor subcontracts that Babajid threw his way out of familial obligation. At the funeral, under a massive white canopy filled with the state's elite, Uncle Deo took the stage. His eyes were red, his voice trembling with a grief that seemed profoundly real. He knelt before the tribal elders, took Tobi's small, shaking hand on his own, and looked up at the portraits of the deceased. "My brother, Babajid," Deo cried out, his voice echoing through the PA system. "You did not leave a void. You left a legacy. Before God, I vow to raise Tobi as my own flesh and blood. Every brick you laid, every plot of land you bought, I will guard with my life until this boy is ready to take his rightful place. He will never know the lack. He will never know loneliness." The crowd erupted into sympathetic tears and applause. The elders nodded in approval, praising Deo's nobility. Tobi, looking up at his uncle, felt a tiny spark of hope. Perhaps he wasn't completely alone. But the moment the funeral guests departed and the canopies were folded away, the mask slipped. Within 3 months of the funeral, Deo moved into the Ikoyi mansion. But he did not bring Tobi comfort. Instead, he brought a parade of shady characters in cheap suits. Among them was Chief Adebayo, a notoriously corrupt estate lawyer. Tobi would lie awake at night, listening to the muffled voices coming from his late father's study. "The boy is 9, Deo," Adebayo's voice drifted through the floorboards. "If we execute the transfer deeds now, we will need to bypass the probate registry entirely. It requires backdating the power of attorney. It's risky, but with enough grease in the right palms, we can make the probate office lose the original will." "Just do it," Deo hissed in reply. "Babajid always thought he was better than me. Now, he's under the dirt, and his money belongs to someone who actually knows how to live. Get the documents ready. I will sign them as the sole executor and guardian." Deo was ruthless in his efficiency. Armed with forged signatures and a heavily bribed legal team, he dismantled Babajid's life's work block by block. He transferred the ownership of 24 prime landed properties in Lekki and Victoria Island to his personal offshore accounts. He secretly liquidated Alao and Sons infrastructure, selling off the heavy machinery, the trucks, and the cranes to competitors. He fired the loyal, long-serving staff who dared to ask questions, replacing them with associates who kept their mouths shut. To the public, Deo spun a tragic narrative. He gave interviews to local business magazines lamenting that Babajid had been a reckless manager. He claimed that behind the glittering facade, Alao and Sons was drowning in unpayable debts, and that he was sacrificing his own personal funds to pay off his late brother's creditors. "I tried to save it," Deo would sigh dramatically over drinks at the Lagos Yacht Club. But my brother left nothing but ash. It is a miracle we aren't all in prison for his debts. By the end of the year, the Ikoyi mansion was sold, and the company was officially dissolved. Toby was told they were moving to a smaller house. But instead, on a cold, dusty Harmattan morning, Uncle Deo packed Toby's few belongings into the boot of a Mercedes-Benz and drove him far out of the city, past the sprawling markets of Ketu, into the dusty outskirts of Ikorodu. The car pulled up in front of a dilapidated, two-story building surrounded by a rusty barbed wire fence. A faded sign on the gate read, "Divine Mercy Home for the Fatherless." Toby's heart seized. "Uncle Deo, why are we here? Is this where you're going to live?" Deo did not look at him. He got out of the car, grabbed Toby's single duffel bag, and marched him into the administrator's office. He handed a thick envelope of cash to a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Oak. "This is the boy," Deo said, his voice completely stripped of the warmth he had displayed at the funeral. "His parents are dead. He has no living relatives. Do not contact me again. If anyone asks, he was dropped off anonymously." Toby grabbed his uncle's expensive lace agbada, tears streaming down his face. "Uncle, please. You promised Daddy. You promised you would look after me." Deo violently wrenched his clothes from the boy's grip. He knelt down, his eyes cold, hard, and devoid of any humanity. "Look at me, Tobaloba," Deo whispered, his breath smelling of expensive brandy and stale tobacco. "Listen to me very carefully. Your father is dead. His company is gone. Your home is gone. You're nothing now. By the time you grow up, nobody will remember who your father was." Without another word, Deo turned on his heel and walked out. Toby ran to the window, screaming his uncle's name, watching through the iron bars as the black Mercedes kicked up a cloud of red dust, disappearing into the Lagos traffic. Life at Divine Mercy Home was a daily exercise in survival. Mrs. Oak, the administrator, was a woman who had long since traded her compassion for cold survival instincts. The money Deo had left was quickly absorbed into her personal accounts, and Toby was treated like every other nameless orphan in the crowded dormitories. The rooms were stiflingly hot, mosquito-ridden, and smelled of damp plaster. Meals were a monotonous cycle of watery beans and yellow Gary, barely enough to keep a growing boy's ribs from pressing against his skin. Toby quickly learned that the weak were preyed upon. Older boys would steal his food rations, and the staff would hand out harsh beatings for the slightest infraction. But the physical hunger was nothing compared to the crushing weight of loneliness. On visiting days, Toby would sit on the concrete porch, watching other children preen and smile as prospective adoptive parents walked through the gates. He would pray, with a desperation that burned in his chest, that someone would look at him and see his son. But adoption never came for Toby. He was too quiet, too solemn, and carried an intensity in his eyes that intimidated visitors. As the years crawled by, Toby realized that no savior was coming. If he was to survive, he had to build his own ladder out of the pit. At age 16, Toby made a quiet vow to himself. He stood before the cracked mirror in the communal bathroom, looking at his lean, muscular frame and the hard set of his jaw. He was no longer the frightened, 9-year-old boy who had been abandoned in the dust. "I will remember," he whispered to his reflection, "and I will make them remember." When he turned 18, he was formally aged out of the orphanage. Mrs. Oak handed him his birth certificate, his late mother's small silver wristwatch, which he had managed to hide under his mattress for 9 years, and 50,000 naira. The heavy iron gates of Divine Mercy slammed shut behind him. Toby took a room in a crowded face-to-face tenement building in Bariga, where 10 families shared a single bathroom and kitchen. He took whatever work he could find to survive. During the day, he worked as an offloader at the Mile 12 market, carrying heavy crates of tomatoes and yams on his shoulders under the scorching sun until his back bled. In the afternoon, he worked as a site laborer, mixing mortar and carrying headpans of cement for building projects. Ironically, sometimes working on sites that had once belonged to his father. And at night, he walked 2 miles to an evening tutorial center, studying by the flickering light of a rechargeable lamp or a noisy generator. His mind was his sharpest weapon. Toby possessed his father's analytical brain and his mother's photographic memory. While other laborers spent their meager earnings on local gin and gambling, Toby bought secondhand textbooks on advanced mathematics, structural engineering, and business management. His breakthrough came when he was 22. The Shell Petroleum Development Company announced a prestigious national scholarship scheme for underprivileged students who wished to study engineering abroad. It was an extremely competitive exam, with tens of thousands of applicants vying for just 3 slots. For 6 months, Toby barely slept. He studied at his construction sites during his 15-minute lunch breaks, drawing structural diagrams in the dirt with a stick. He memorized entire calculus textbooks. On the day of the exam, he sat in a massive hall in University of Lagos, surrounded by wealthy kids in crisp clothes who had attended elite private schools. Toby wore a faded shirt and shoes with worn-out soles, but his hands did not shake. 2 months later, the results were published in the national dailies, and in first place nationwide was Tobiloba Alau with a score of 98%. The scholarship took him to the United Kingdom, where he enrolled at the University of Manchester to study civil engineering and computational technology. For Toby, England was not a place for leisure. While his classmates explored the pubs and clubs of Manchester, Toby lived like a monk. He graduated at the top of his class and went on to complete a master's degree in entrepreneurship and construction tech. It was during his postgraduate studies that Toby co-developed a proprietary software system called AeroBuild. The platform integrated real-time drone mapping with structural stress testing algorithms, reducing construction material waste by 40% and predicting structural failures before ground was even broken. At 28, Toby co-founded AeroBuild Technologies. Within 4 years, the company secured major municipal contracts across East Africa, the UK, and Germany. Toby was no longer a starving orphan from Bariga. He was a multi-millionaire tech CEO, operating from a sleek office in London's financial district. Yet, despite his immense success, Toby lived a Spartan life. He did not buy sports cars or luxury mansions. His wealth had only one purpose. It was the fuel for a machine he was building to dismantle his uncle's life. During his years abroad, Toby kept close tabs on Uncle Deo. Deo had used the stolen wealth to establish Aladeo International Holdings, a conglomerate with interests in real estate, logistics, and government contracts. Deo had successfully rebranded himself. He was now a prominent Lagos socialite, often seen wearing pristine white lace batas, surrounded by praise singers. He was a philanthropist. He donated large sums to elite schools, sponsored high society weddings, and sat on the boards of several prestigious non-governmental organizations. The national newspapers ran glowing profiles of him, describing him as a visionary builder and a pillar of the community. Toby would sit in his cold London apartment, staring at the digital copies of these articles. He watched the man who had left him to rot in an orphanage being celebrated as a saint. The injustice of it burned in his throat like acid. But Toby knew that simply flying back to Lagos and shouting the truth from the rooftops would achieve nothing. Deo was too powerful, too well-connected. The police would dismiss Toby as an imposter, and the public would view him as an envious, unstable young man trying to blackmail a great philanthropist. "If you want to fell a giant tree," Toby muttered to himself, tracing a finger over a photograph of his uncle in a business magazine, "you do not chop at the leaves. You dig up the roots." In the dusty, humid heat of a November afternoon, Toby returned to Nigeria. He did not arrive under his own name, nor did he check into any of the hotels where the Lagos elite gathered. He rented a quiet, heavily secured penthouse in Ikoyi through a shell company registered in Delaware. He hired Chidi, a brilliant and fiercely loyal forensic accountant who had spent years auditing corporate fraud in South Africa. Together, they set up a war room. "What do we have on Aladeo International?" Toby asked, staring at a massive whiteboard covered in corporate flowcharts, bank statements, and legal documents. Chidi adjusted his glasses, tapping a stack of red folders on the desk. "Toby, the situation is much worse than we thought. For him, at least. Your uncle is a terrible businessman. He built his empire on stolen capital. but he has no idea how to manage a sustainable enterprise. Chitty walked over to the whiteboard, drawing a thick red line through several of Deo's subsidiaries. Over the last 5 years, Deo has made a series of disastrous, high-risk real estate investments in Lekki Phase 2. He borrowed heavily from local banks, expecting a massive boom that never materialized. Worse, his logistics company has been hit by massive internal embezzlement. His flagship construction company, Aladeo Infrastructure, is essentially a hollow shell. They are drowning in debt, and they have been default rolling their loans for 18 months. Tobi leaned forward, a cold smile playing on his lips. How close are they to the edge? 1 bad month away from liquidation, Chitty replied. They desperately need a massive capital injection. They've been quietly shopping around for an institutional investor to buy a controlling stake in the company. If they don't find one within 60 days, the banks will foreclose and the whole house of cards collapses. Then we will be their saviors, Tobi said softly. Operating through Apex Capital Alliance, an offshore investment fund based in Mauritius, Tobi initiated the acquisition process. He used a team of highly polished, foreign-trained representatives to front the negotiations. To Deo, Apex Capital looked like a godsend, a wealthy foreign venture fund looking to expand its footprint in the West African infrastructure market. The negotiations were swift. Deo, desperate to keep his creditors at bay and maintain his public image, greedily accepted a deal. Apex Capital Alliance acquired a 51% controlling stake in Aladeo International Holdings for $12 million. Deo remained as the nominal executive chairman and managing director, but the contract contained a crucial clause. Every major capital project, expenditure over 5 million naira, and executive hiring decision now required the absolute, written approval of Apex Capital's designated representative. The trap was sprung. The following week, the first joint board meeting was scheduled at the corporate headquarters of Aladeo International in Victoria Island. Tobi arrived early. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, his hair neatly cropped, his face bearing the calm, unreadable expression of a seasoned international executive. When Deo entered the boardroom, he was flanked by his junior directors and assistants. He looked older than Tobi remembered. The years of stress and cover-ups had carved deep lines into his forehead, though his posture remained arrogant, draped in his signature expensive white buba. Deo took his seat at the head of the long mahogany table. He looked at Tobi, who was sitting directly opposite him. Deo's eyes lingered on Tobi's face for a long, agonizing moment. Tobi felt his pulse hammer in his ears. The anger that had simmered inside him for over 2 decades threatened to boil over. He saw the face of the man who had watched him cry, who had abandoned him in the dust of Ikorodu, who had stolen his parents' legacy. Does he recognize me? Tobi thought, his fists clenching under the table. Deo blinked, a slight frown crossing his brow. He shook his head slightly, as if dismissing a fleeting thought. To him, the young man sitting across from him was just another cold, arrogant Ivy League-style analyst sent by the foreign investors. He had no memory of the scrawny, terrified 9-year-old boy he had thrown away. "Welcome, gentlemen," Deo said, spreading his hands wide with his practiced, theatrical warmth. "We are delighted to partner with Apex Capital. Together, we will take this company to new heights. We share your enthusiasm, Chief Alau," Tobi replied, his voice deep, steady, and perfectly calm. "I am Tobi Obajide, the lead executive appointed by Apex to oversee the restructuring." He had deliberately used a variation of his middle name and his father's name, a subtle tease that went completely over Deo's head. For the next 3 weeks, Tobi lived a double life. Every single day, he sat across from his uncle. He watched Deo bluster through meetings, lie about project delivery dates, and attempt to siphon corporate funds into his personal accounts under the guise of public relations expenses. Tobi rejected every single one of Deo's fraudulent requests. "This 300 million naira marketing expense is denied, Chief Alau," Tobi said during a private budget review, sliding a document back across the table. Deo slammed his hand on the wood, his face turning a dark, mottled red. Listen to me, young man. You may represent the investors, but I built this company from nothing. I know how business is run in this country. That money is for key stakeholders. It is an unvouched cash expenditure with no clear return on investment, Toby replied, looking directly into his uncle's angry eyes without flinching. Under Apex guidelines, it is classified as a compliance risk. The decision stands. Deo glared at him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. You think you can come here with your foreign degrees and dictate terms to me? I have survived bigger men than you. I don't doubt that, Chief Alao, Toby said softly, leaning back in his leather chair. But you have never dealt with me. As Deo stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him, Toby let out a long, shaky breath. He looked at his hands. They were trembling. The greatest battle was no longer against Deo's corporate defenses. It was against the darkness in his own heart. He could easily ruin Deo financially right now. He could starve the company of funds, force it into bankruptcy, and watch his uncle go down in flames. But Toby wanted more than just financial ruin. He wanted justice. He wanted the truth to be laid bare in the light of day, so that the world would see the monster beneath the philanthropist's robes. Just as Toby prepared to compile his evidence and initiate a full forensic audit that would expose Deo's past fraudulent transactions, the tide turned. Deo was many things, but he was not stupid. He had begun to notice that the investigations by Apex Capital were not just focused on current operations. The foreign auditors were digging into the historical archives of Aladeo International. Specifically, the period 23 years ago when the company had suddenly absorbed the assets of Alao and Sons infrastructure. Panic set in. Deo realized that someone was actively hunting for the ghosts of his past. One evening, Chitty called Toby, his voice tense with alarm. Toby, we have a major problem. Deo is covering his tracks. He's destroying everything. Toby sat up in his chair, his body instantly alert. What do you mean? Chief Adebayo, the lawyer who forged your father's inheritance papers. He's dead. He supposedly died of a sudden heart attack in his sleep last night. But Toby, his office was burgled 3 days ago. All his old client files from 20 years ago were cleared out. Toby felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. And the others? It gets worse, Chitty continued. I sent a courier to the Divine Mercy Home in Ikordu to secure the old intake registries from the year you were abandoned. The registry building was destroyed in a fire last night. The local police are calling it an electrical fault, but witnesses say they saw men in unmarked cars leaving the compound right before the smoke appeared. Toby slammed his fist against the wall. He's erasing the paper trail. He's killing the witnesses. There's more, Chitty said grimly. Deo has gone on the offensive. The next morning, the front pages of several major national newspapers carried a coordinated smear campaign. The articles accused Apex Capital Alliance and its lead executive, Toby Obadjide, of being corporate raiders. They claimed that a foreign syndicate was using predatory loan practices and illegal surveillance to hostilely take over a cherished, indigenous family business. Deo held a televised press conference, standing before a crowd of cheering employees who had been paid to protest. These foreign-trained elements want to destroy what we have built, Deo declared into the microphones, wiping fake tears from his eyes. They want to ruin our legacy for their personal gain. I have spent my life helping this nation, employing thousands of our youth, and doing charity. I will not let these nameless, faceless entities steal our heritage. The public narrative shifted overnight. Public sympathy swelled toward Deo, the victimized local philanthropist. Toby's office was flooded with angry emails, and several key government regulatory agencies threatened to launch investigations into Apex Capital's acquisition. Toby stood by the window of his penthouse, looking out over the glittering lights of the Lagos Lagoon. For the first time since he was 9 years old, a deep, hollow despair threatened to swallow him. Deo had successfully rewritten history once before, and it seemed he was doing it again. The lawyer was dead, the orphanage records were ash, and the public adored the liar. Is justice even possible in this world? Toby thought, staring into the dark water. Or does the devil always win if he has enough money? He reached into his pocket and pulled out his mother's old silver wristwatch. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the scratches on the metal casing. It was the only physical connection he had left to his parents. As he turned the watch over, his thumb caught on a small, slight indentation near the battery compartment cover. Toby frowned. He had held this watch thousands of times, but in the dim light of the penthouse, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. He walked over to his desk, grabbed a small magnifying glass and a precision screwdriver from his electronics kit. He carefully pried open the secondary metal backplate. A tiny, rusted metal key, no larger than a fingernail, fell out onto the desk. Along with the key was a tiny, faded piece of paper rolled up like a cigarette. Toby unrolled it with extreme care. Written in his father's precise, elegant engineering handwriting was a single line. Universe Bank of Nigeria, Main Branch, Marina. Safe deposit box number 412. Toby's breath hitched. The next morning, before the sun had fully burned through the Lagos morning fog, Toby was standing in the vault of the historic Universe Bank building in Marina. The branch manager, an elderly gentleman who had been with the bank for over 30 years, looked at the rusted key, then at Toby's birth certificate and his late father's old banking records. "Your father was a great man, Mr. Alao," the manager said quietly, his voice echoing in the cold, concrete vault. "He rented this box 3 weeks before his untimely passing. He gave strict instructions that only you, upon presenting this specific key and your adult identification, could ever access it." The manager slid a heavy, dusty steel box across the table. Toby's hands shook as he inserted the tiny key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. He opened the lid. Sitting inside, perfectly preserved and sealed, waterproof plastic sleeves, were the ghosts of his past. The original title deeds, the genuine, uncompromised land registry documents for every single property his father had owned, bearing the official stamp of the Lagos state government. The original will, signed by Babajide Alao and witnessed by 3 high court judges, declaring Tobiloba Alao as the sole, absolute heir to his entire estate, with no provision for Aladeo Alao. A handwritten letter, written by his father to Toby, filled with words of love, guidance, and a warning that he had begun to suspect Deo was conspiring with hostile forces to undermine the company. And at the bottom of the box was a small, ancient Sony Hi8 video camcorder tape. Toby immediately purchased a vintage camcorder from an electronics dealer in Acadia to digitize the tape. When a video file loaded on his laptop, Toby saw his father. Babajide looked tired but resolute. He sat at his old mahogany desk in the Ikoyi mansion, the very desk Deo had sat at for years. "Tobiloba, my son," Babajide's voice came through the speakers, warm, deep, and full of life. Toby's eyes filled with tears at the sound. "If you're watching this, it means your mother and I are no longer with you. I am making this recording because I have discovered that my brother, Deo, has been secretly falsifying company ledgers and plotting to seize control of our assets. I have set up this safety deposit box as your ultimate shield. Deo is only a temporary guardian of our family name, entrusted to protect, not possess, your inheritance. Do not let him or anyone else convince you that you are nothing. You are an Alao. Build with integrity, my boy. The truth is like concrete. Once it sets, no force on earth can bend it." Toby closed his laptop. He wiped the tears from his cheeks. His eyes were no longer filled with despair. They were filled with fire. The grand ballroom of the Eco Hotel and Suites was packed to capacity for the annual general meeting of Aladeo International Holdings. It was a highly anticipated event. The financial press was there in full force, eager to see if the embattled chairman, Aladeo Alao, would survive the onslaught of the foreign corporate raiders. Deo sat on the elevated stage, surrounded by his board of directors. He looked confident, wearing an opulent, hand-embroidered white agbada and a matching cap. He smiled and waved at the cameras, basking in the supportive cheers of the shareholders who had been fed a steady diet of nationalistic PR. Toby sat in the front row of the audience, flanked by Chitty and a team of top-tier corporate attorneys. Deo took the microphone, delivering a rousing, passionate speech about indigenous enterprise, national pride, and his commitment to protecting the legacy of the Alau name. "We will not be intimidated by foreign funds," Deo thundered, receiving a standing ovation. "We will defend our heritage." As the applause died down, the master of ceremonies stepped to the podium. "We will now open the floor to the representatives of our majority shareholder, Apex Capital Alliance, for their address." A hush fell over the room. Tobi stood up. He did not walk to the floor microphone. Instead, he slowly walked up the steps onto the main stage, taking his place at the central podium. Deo glared at him from his seat, his eyes filled with contempt. Tobi adjusted the microphone. He looked out at the sea of faces, the journalists, the investors, the employees, the community leaders who had praised his uncle for decades. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," Tobi began, his voice calm, resonant, and carrying a strange, compelling weight. "For the past several weeks, you have heard a lot about legacy. You have heard about the Alau heritage. But today, we're going to talk about the truth." Tobi looked directly at his uncle. 23 years ago, a 9-year-old boy stood at his parents' graves. At that funeral, a man stood before the family and publicly promised that he would raise that boy as his own son. He promised he would protect everything his brother had built. Deo's smile froze. The color slowly began to drain from his face. But behind closed doors, Tobi continued, his voice growing cold as steel. That man had already bribed a corrupt lawyer to forge ownership documents. He secretly transferred every property into his own name, sold off the machinery, dissolved the company, and lied to the world that his brother died bankrupt. The boardroom directors began to whisper frantically among themselves. The journalists leaned forward, their cameras flashing. And once there was nothing left to steal, Tobi's voice echoed through the massive hall. He took that 9-year-old boy and abandoned him at a dilapidated orphanage in Ikordu, telling the staff to never let anyone contact him. Deo stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the stage floor. "What is the meaning of this nonsense? Security, escort this madman out of here. He is trying to disrupt our meeting." 2 muscular security guards moved toward the stage. "I suggest you let him speak." Tobi's lead lawyer stood up, holding a court injunction. "We are operating under a federal high court warrant." Tobi did not wait. He tapped his laptop on the podium. The massive projector screens behind the stage flickered to life. Instead of the corporate financial slides everyone expected, a digitized video began to play. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. On the screen was the face of Babajid Alau. The older generation of investors in the room immediately recognized him. He was a legend. "Tobaloba, my son," Babajid's voice boomed through the ballroom's state-of-the-art sound system. "If you're watching this, it means your mother and I are no longer with you. Deo has been secretly falsifying company ledgers and plotting to seize control of our assets." The room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. Tobi tapped the laptop again. The screen shifted to display high-resolution scans of the original title deeds from the safety deposit box, side by side with the forged documents signed by Deo and Chief Adebayo. The differences were glaringly obvious. The forgery was undeniable. Next came the bank statement from 23 years ago, tracing the direct transfer of millions of dollars from Alau and Sons accounts directly into Deo's private offshore holdings. "My name," Tobi said, his voice echoing in the silent room, "is Tobaloba Alau. I am the son of Babajid Alau, and I am the true, sole owner of this company." The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Journalists surged forward, their cameras clicking furiously. Shareholders stood on their chairs, shouting in disbelief. Deo stared at the screen, his mouth open in a silent scream of horror. He looked at the video of his dead brother, then at the forged signatures, and finally, he looked at Tobi. For the first time, he saw the resemblance. He saw his brother's eyes, the same deep, uncompromising gaze, looking back at him from the face of the man who had systematically dismantled his empire. "You," Deo whispered, his knees buckling. "It's you." Yes, Uncle, Toby said, stepping away from the podium and walking over to stand directly in front of him. It is me. At that moment, the double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. 6 police officers marched down the center aisle. They ascended the stage, presenting an arrest warrant to Deo. Chief Aladeo Alau, the lead officer said, his voice carrying over the din of the crowd. You are under arrest for corporate fraud, forgery, asset theft, and conspiracy. As the officers stepped forward to cuff him, the grand, untouchable philanthropist collapsed. The pride that had sustained him for 23 years evaporated in an instant. He fell to his knees on the carpeted stage, his expensive lace agbada trailing in the dust. He grabbed Toby's trousers, tears of terror and humiliation streaming down his face. Toby, please. Deo wept, his voice cracking. I am your father's brother. We share the same blood. Forgive me. I did it for the family. Please don't destroy me. Toby looked down at the weeping, broken man. For years, he had imagined this moment. He had envisioned himself screaming, striking his uncle, or laughing at his ruin. But now, looking at Deo groveling on the floor, Toby felt no joy. He felt only a profound, quiet peace. The anger that had burned inside him for 23 years had finally gone out, leaving behind only the solid, unyielding foundation of truth. He gently but firmly pulled his trousers from Deo's desperate grasp. You didn't just steal my inheritance, Uncle Deo, Toby said, his voice quiet but echoing to every corner of the stage. You stole my childhood. You left a 9-year-old boy to starve in the dirt. But I refuse to let your betrayal steal my future too. I will not seek personal revenge against you. I will simply let the law do its work. Toby turned his back on him. The police hoisted the sobbing, broken Deo to his feet and escorted him out of the ballroom, through a gauntlet of flashing cameras and shouting journalists. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled over the Alau estate. The court proceedings had been swift. Armed with the undeniable evidence from the safety deposit box, Toby's legal team successfully reverted all of Babajid's original assets and properties back to Toby's custody. Deo's personal assets were seized to pay off the massive debts he had accumulated, and he was sentenced to 12 years in prison for corporate fraud and forgery. Toby did not keep the wealth for himself. He consolidated his technology firm, AeroBuild Global, with his father's resurrected company, rebranding it as the Alau Build Group. On the very site in Ikordu where the dilapidated Divine Mercy home had once stood, Toby built something new. He constructed the Babajid and Fonmaleo Alau Legacy Center. It was a state-of-the-art campus featuring a modern residential home for abandoned children, a fully funded primary and secondary academy, a vocational training center focusing on engineering and technology, and a scholarship fund designed to send underprivileged youth to top universities worldwide. On the day of the center's grand opening, Toby stood on the immaculate lawns, watching children in bright blue uniforms laughing and playing on the swings. The sun was setting over the lagoon, casting a warm, golden glow over the concrete structures. Chitty walked up to him, handing him a glass of water. It's a beautiful place, Toby. Your father would be incredibly proud. Toby smiled, looking up at the bronze plaque near the entrance, which bore his parents' names and a single inscription. Integrity is the only foundation that time cannot erode. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his mother's old silver watch. He strapped it onto his wrist. It was no longer a symbol of loss or a reminder of abandonment. It was a reminder that while wealth stolen through greed may last for a season, a legacy built on character, resilience, and truth is a structure that stands forever. If you find this story meaningful, kindly like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories updates. Also, what lesson did you learn from this story? We would like to know in the comments. Thank you for watching.